Africa's poverty is the result of a complex combination of historical, political, economic, and social factors. Here are some key reasons anyway. These are the 10 reasons why Africa is a very poor continent anyway. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment. Why is Africa a poor continent? Let's get right away into the details. Number 1. Exploitation of resources during the colonial period, roughly from the 19th century until the mid-20th century. European powers extracted vast amounts of natural resources from Africa, often without reinvesting in local economies. Colonial administrations prioritized the extraction of minerals, cash crops, and labor over local development. Artificial borders, colonial borders, were often drawn without regard to ethnic, cultural, or geographical factors, leading to political instability, ethnic tensions, and conflicts after independence. Number 2. Post-colonial challenges. Weak institutions. Many African countries, upon gaining independence, inherited weak institutions that were not designed to function effectively in the interest of local populations. This made governance, economic planning, and service delivery inefficient. Corruption. Post-independence leaders often struggled with corruption and mismanagement, diverting resources away from development. Number 3. Political instability and conflict. Civil wars and conflict. Many African nations have experienced prolonged periods of conflict and civil war, often fueled by ethnic tensions, struggles over resources, or power. This has disrupted economies, displaced populations, and led to the destruction of infrastructure. Civil wars and conflict. Many African nations have experienced prolonged periods of conflict and civil war, often fueled by ethnic tensions, struggles over resources, or power. This has disrupted economies, displaced populations, and led to the destruction of infrastructure. Authoritarian regimes. In many countries, authoritarian regimes have emerged, often staying in power through repression rather than focusing on economic development or good governance. Number 4. Economic dependence and poor diversification. Resource curse. Many African countries are heavily dependent on a single resource or commodity, such as oil, minerals, or a specific cash crop, making them vulnerable to global price fluctuations. This lack of economic diversification limits the potential for broader, more resilient economic growth. Limited industrialization. Africa has lagged in industrialization, meaning most countries rely on exporting raw materials rather than producing value-added goods. This limits the growth of a middle class and sustainable jobs. Number 5. Debt and structural adjustment programs. Debt burden. Many African countries took on significant foreign debt in the 1970s and 1980s. In response to their inability to service this debt, international lenders like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and World Bank imposed structural adjustment programs, SAPs, in the 1980s and 1990s, which forced cuts to public spending, often reducing investment in health, education, and infrastructure. Number 6. Underdeveloped infrastructure. Poor infrastructure. Many African nations suffer from a lack of basic infrastructure, such as roads, electricity, and clean water. This hinders economic activity and growth, particularly in rural areas where agriculture is often the main livelihood. Lack of education and healthcare. Inadequate investment in education and healthcare limits human capital development, making it harder for the workforce to compete in a globalized economy. Number 7. Climate change and environmental challenges. Droughts and desertification. Africa is highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, particularly in regions where agriculture is central to the economy. Droughts, floods, and desertification have increasingly worsened food security and livelihoods in many parts of the continent. Deforestation and soil degradation. Environmental degradation has led to reduced agricultural productivity in many countries. Number 8. Global trade inequality. Unfavorable trade terms. Many African countries have historically been disadvantaged in global trade. They export raw materials and import expensive manufactured goods, resulting in trade imbalances. In addition, trade policies imposed by wealthier nations often restrict access to global markets for African goods. Number 9. Population growth and demographic pressures. High population growth. Africa has one of the highest rates of population growth in the world, putting pressure on resources like land, water, and food. Rapid urbanization has led to the growth of informal settlements in cities, where poverty is particularly concentrated. Youth unemployment, with a large proportion of the population under 25. Many African countries struggle to provide enough jobs and opportunities for young people. Number 10. Foreign influence and aid dependency. Aid dependency. While foreign aid has provided vital support for humanitarian needs, it can also create dependencies and stifle local initiatives. Donor countries sometimes impose conditions on aid that may not align with the recipient country's long-term development goals. Neocolonialism critics argue that foreign economic policies and multinational corporations still exercise significant control over African economies, exploiting resources and limiting local economic autonomy. Now, despite these challenges, it is important to note that Africa is not uniformly poor. Some countries have experienced significant economic growth, and there are regions with vibrant economies and rising middle classes. Efforts are also being made across the continent to address these issues through regional cooperation, investment in infrastructure, and governance reforms. Anyway, subscribe, like, and comment, and in my next video, I will show you the top 10 countries have economically grown.